Before my father was even lowered into the ground, someone tried to take his crown. They thought grief made people weak. They thought silence meant surrender. What they didn't know was that every move they made that day triggered something my father had set in motion long before his heart stopped beating. And before I tell you how a funeral turned into a reckoning, take a second to support the story. Subscribe if you haven't already, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and help this reach people who know what it's like to be underestimated. My name is Claire Holloway, and the silence at my father's funeral felt physical, like a weight pressing down on my lungs. We were standing inside St. Mark's Cathedral in Boston, a place built for echoes and absolution, surrounded by people in tailored black suits who ran ports, fleets, and global supply chains. My father, Richard Holloway, wasn't just a man to them, he was an institution. Founder of a transportation empire valued at just over $700 million, he had built it from nothing but grit, cold mornings, and stubborn discipline. But grief wasn't what filled that cathedral. Ambition was. My brother Ethan stood in the front row beside his wife Vanessa, both dressed like they were attending a shareholder gala instead of a funeral. Vanessa's heels clicked against marble as if the building itself owed her attention. Ethan kept adjusting his tie. Italian silk, custom cut, the kind of detail you notice when someone thinks eyes are already on them. The priest had barely finished the final prayer when Vanessa reached for the microphone. Not asked, not invited. She took it. Her voice cut through the cathedral, sharp and confident. "Richard Holloway's legacy will live on," she said, smiling as she turned toward the board members. "And I'm proud to announce that my husband, Ethan Holloway, will be stepping in as CEO effective immediately." She paused, waiting for applause. Some people shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged looks. No one clapped. Then it happened. A sound rolled through the cathedral speaker system, deep, dry, unmistakable. A laugh. Not nervous. Not polite. Calculated. It came from the direction of my father's coffin. Ethan's face drained of color. Vanessa froze mid-smile. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd as heads turned toward the altar, toward the closed casket draped in white lilies. It wasn't a ghost. It was a recording. But the fear on my brother's face, that was real. As the sound faded, and the massive projector screen behind the altar flickered to life, my mind drifted backward, away from the cathedral and into the places where this empire had actually been built. Not in boardrooms. In truck yards outside Toledo at 4 a.m, where diesel fumes clung to your clothes. In frozen depots near Duluth, where drivers argued contracts with numb fingers and no patience for excuses. While Ethan was posting photos from Monaco and calling it business development, I was standing knee-deep in slush negotiating strike deadlines, so medical supplies didn't miss delivery. For 10 years, I was invisible by design. I was the person executives called when systems failed and deals fell apart. I was the one who rerouted shipments during hurricanes, who sat with compliance teams during audits, who rebuilt routing software after a ransomware attack wiped half our servers. I missed weddings. I missed birthdays. I missed entire years of my own life because something always needed fixing. And I fixed it, not because I loved the pressure, but because I believed something that turned out to be dangerously naive. I believed competence would be enough. I told myself that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, delivered results without demanding credit, merit would eventually outweigh bloodlines. In logistics, a woman who speaks up is labeled difficult. A woman who fixes disasters quietly becomes indispensable. So I became indispensable. I saved the company over $15 million in wasted fuel contracts in one fiscal year. I redesigned shipping corridors that increased delivery efficiency by 18%. I wore exhaustion like armor and silence like loyalty. And by doing that, I taught them exactly how to erase me. Sitting in that cathedral, watching Vanessa grip the microphone like it belonged to her, I finally understood the truth. My silence hadn't been patience. It had been permission. They didn't see me as a partner. They saw me as infrastructure. You don't praise the foundation of a building. You assume it will always hold. That assumption was their mistake. Because while they thought I was invisible, I was keeping records. Every misused fund, every reckless investment, every time Ethan took credit for deals I closed. I wasn't just working, I was documenting. And I wasn't the only one. As the screen behind the altar stabilized, revealing my father seated at his desk, his expression hard and focused. I felt something settle inside me. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a man about to end a meeting. The laughter echoed again, lower this time, and then my father's recorded voice filled the cathedral. "Ethan," he said calmly. My brother stiffened. What none of them knew, what Vanessa, Ethan, and half the board had completely missed, was that 3 days earlier, while they were already planning how to spend money that wasn't theirs, something irreversible had been set into motion. And that's where the story truly begins. If you're ready, tell me to continue, and I'll take you back to the moment they thought the throne was empty. 3 days earlier, my father had been gone for less than 4 hours. The coroner had just left the house in Brookline, Massachusetts, and the smell of antiseptic still hung in the air. The clocks hadn't even been reset yet. The house was quiet in that strange way where nothing feels real, like the walls themselves are holding their breath. Ethan and Vanessa didn't. They didn't go to the funeral home. They didn't sit with my mother's old photo albums. They didn't call relatives or check on employees who'd worked for my father for decades. They went straight to Holloway Logistics headquarters. I was already there. I was sitting in my father's office with Mark Ellison, his chief of staff for 40 years. Mark had gray hair, tired eyes, and the kind of loyalty you earn only after surviving wars together, union strikes, fuel shortages, market crashes. We weren't crying. We were working. The phones hadn't stopped ringing. International partners needed reassurance. The stock price was wobbling. Drivers were scared. Grief didn't pause the supply chain. Then the elevator doors opened. Ethan walked out like he was entering a victory parade. He wasn't wearing black. He wore a navy suit so crisp it looked untouched by reality. Vanessa followed behind him, tapping furiously on her phone, heels clicking like gunfire against marble floors. Ethan didn't ask how my father died. He didn't ask if arrangements were made. He walked straight to the massive oak desk my father had built by hand 30 years earlier and ran his fingers along the edge. "This has to go," he said casually. "Too old school. I want glass. Chrome. Something visionary." Vanessa looked up from her phone. "I already called a designer. We're gutting this entire floor. It smells like diesel and old men." Mark stood slowly, grief etched deep into his face. "There's a liquidity issue we need to address first," he said carefully. "Drivers are worried about their pensions. We need stability before." Ethan laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A dismissive one. "Relax, Mark," he said. "You're not going to be around much longer anyway. We need fresh blood. Consider this your notice." Mark didn't move. His jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Then Ethan turned to me. I was holding a stack of urgent shipping manifests. Medical equipment delayed at customs in Antwerp, fuel reroutes through Quebec, payroll approvals that couldn't wait. Ethan took the papers from my hands and dropped them on the floor. "And you, Claire," he said, smirking. "We need a real face for this company. Someone with charisma. You're good at the boring stuff. Filing. Organizing. Keeping the lights on." Vanessa laughed. "She's basically an executive assistant with better math." They talked openly then, like we weren't even there. Liquidating part of the trucking fleet to free up cash. Selling a regional warehouse to fund a villa in Lake Como. Cutting long-term contracts for short-term optics. They weren't leading. They were looting. I didn't argue. I knelt down, gathered the papers neatly, and stood back up. When I looked at Mark, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Fire. That was the moment the plan was born. They wanted the title. Fine. They just didn't understand that a title without trust is worthless. That afternoon, while Ethan and Vanessa celebrated prematurely, Mark and I moved quietly. We stabilized accounts. Locked secondary authorizations. Reviewed documents my father had insisted on filing years ago, documents Ethan had signed without reading because he never thought he'd need to. My father had never been careless. He had been patient. By the time the funeral arrived, everything was ready. Back in the cathedral, the screen sharpened, and my father's face filled the room. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes cold and focused, the same look he used before firing executives who thought too highly of themselves. "Ethan," his voice boomed, "you've been waiting for this moment for 10 years. A murmur rippled through the congregation. "You thought my generosity meant approval," he continued. "You thought every check I wrote was an endorsement. The image shifted. The video shrank to the corner as a massive spreadsheet filled the screen, rows highlighted in red. A ledger. "Let's review," my father said calmly. Numbers scrolled. A failed nightclub investment in Miami. A luxury car restoration business that collapsed in months. Personal branding consultants costing hundreds of thousands annually. Vanessa's phone slipped from her hand. "People said I was spoiling you," my father went on. "They were wrong. I was testing you." Ethan's face was gray now. "I wanted to see if you'd build or burn." The spreadsheet vanished. My father's face returned, closer now. "You failed." Then came the document. A signed agreement. Ethan's signature unmistakable. My father's voice softened, but only slightly. "They weren't gifts, son. They were loans." The highlighted clause zoomed in. Inheritance forfeiture. Voting rights revoked. Equity transferred upon repayment. My father paused. "Your debt crossed the threshold last month," he said. "And someone paid it." The screen changed again. A bank transfer. $6,200,000. Sender, Claire Holloway. "You didn't lose the company," my father said quietly. "You sold it. And your sister bought it." The cathedral was frozen. Vanessa turned to Ethan, horror dawning. The admiration in her eyes died instantly. My father's final words echoed. "Claire," he said gently, "the keys are in the safe. Do what needs to be done." The screen went black, and the empire shifted hands, right there in silence. And that was only the beginning. The silence after the screen went black was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't respectful. It wasn't mournful. It was stunned. The kind of silence that happens when people realize the ground they're standing on has shifted, and no one knows where to put their feet next. I didn't move right away. Neither did Ethan. Vanessa was the first to react. She turned to him slowly, as if her body needed time to accept what her mind already had. The look on her face wasn't fear. It was calculation collapsing. The future she'd been rehearsing in her head, private jets, galas, magazine profiles, had just evaporated. "You lied to me," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hush. "You told me it was done. You told me the company was yours." Ethan didn't answer her. He couldn't. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His hands were shaking now, visibly, as if his body was finally catching up to the truth. He stood abruptly and stumbled out of the pew, nearly knocking over the man beside him. His eyes locked on me like I was the last solid object in a collapsing room. "Claire," he said, his voice cracking. This isn't real. Dad wasn't thinking straight. He was sick. You know that." I stepped back before he could reach me. "This isn't a conversation," I said evenly. "It's an outcome." He laughed once, desperate and hollow. "You can't do this. We're family. You can't fire family." That word, family used to hold power over me. It used to keep me quiet, keep me compliant. Now it sounded small. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope Mark had prepared. Thick, heavy, final. "This is your termination notice," I said, holding it out but not letting him touch it. "Effective immediately. Your access has already been revoked. Accounts, key cards, systems. Everything." His eyes dropped to the envelope like it was radioactive. "And inside," I continued, "is a repayment schedule for the remaining balance you still owe the estate. 200,000. First payment is due on the 1st of next month." The board members behind him began to shift, checking watches, murmuring quietly. The spectacle was over. Business was resuming. Ethan looked around, as if expecting someone, anyone, to step in. No one did. Vanessa let out a sharp laugh, brittle and furious. "Unbelievable," she said. "I married a liability." She shoved him hard in the chest. "You're useless." Then she turned and walked down the aisle without looking back. Ethan stood there alone, holding nothing, owning nothing. I didn't wait to see him crumble. Walking out of the cathedral felt different than walking in. The air outside was brighter, sharper. Mark was waiting by the car, holding the door open like he had for my father for decades. Today, he held it for me. We drove past the main distribution hub on the way back to headquarters. Trucks lined up at the bays, engines humming, drivers moving with purpose. For years, that sight had filled me with weight, responsibility without authority. Now it felt grounding. Ownership does that. Back at the office, the transition was swift. The board convened. Votes were formalities. The paperwork my father had prepared years earlier made everything clean, legal, unquestionable. By sunset, my name was on every document that mattered. The next morning, my phone buzzed with notifications. Vanessa had filed for divorce. Ethan tried calling. I blocked the number. Then came the emails. From distant relatives, old acquaintances, people who had never once called me when I was fixing crises at 3 a.m. Some congratulated me. Some warned me. Some asked for favors. I ignored most of them. The company didn't slow down. If anything, it stabilized. Drivers noticed immediately. Managers who'd been bracing for chaos relaxed. Vendors stopped hesitating. Leadership isn't about announcing power. It's about removing doubt. A week later, I walked into my father's office alone. The oak desk was still there. I ran my hand along its edge, just like Ethan had, but where he saw an obstacle, I saw history. I opened the safe. Inside were keys, documents, and one handwritten note. Asterisk, you were never invisible. I just needed you ready. Asterisk. I sat there longer than I meant to. Not crying, just breathing. By the end of the month, the company had regained all the market confidence it lost during the uncertainty. Investors stopped calling market midnight. Employees stopped whispering. And Ethan? He sent one last message from a new number. I hope you're happy. I deleted it, because happiness had never been the goal. Stability was. And in the next part, you'll see what happens when the people who underestimated you realize the door isn't just closed. It was never theirs to open in the first place. The weeks after the funeral were the quietest storm I'd ever lived through. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing dramatic was happening. No headlines, no public scandals, no viral clips. But inside the company, everything was being recalibrated, slowly, deliberately, the way my father had taught me. I didn't announce sweeping changes on day one. I didn't replace executives, just to prove authority. I listened. I walked the floors. I visited terminals. I sat in dispatch rooms at dawn and rode with drivers who had been with the company longer than I'd been alive. I asked questions Ethan never bothered to learn the answers to. And in those conversations, I learned something important. People hadn't just been afraid of instability, they'd been bracing for collapse. They told me what they'd seen in the last few years. Contracts pushed through without review. Risky partnerships signed on a whim. Budgets drained for vision projects that never delivered returns. Ethan hadn't just been reckless, he'd been invisible in the places that mattered. That's when I understood the full weight of what my father had done. He hadn't just protected the company legally, he'd protected it culturally. By keeping Ethan out of real operations, he kept the damage contained. By putting me in the trenches, he prepared someone who could step in without breaking stride. Within a month, I froze all non-essential spending. Within 2, I renegotiated fuel contracts that saved millions annually. By the end of the quarter, we'd reversed the stock dip completely. Analysts called it unexpected resilience. It wasn't unexpected to the people who actually did the work. Ethan, meanwhile, was unraveling. At first, it was subtle. Requests through intermediaries. A former board member asking if I'd consider meeting him for closure. A cousin hinting that maybe I was being too harsh. Then it escalated. He showed up at headquarters one morning. Security stopped him before he made it past the lobby. I watched from my office as he argued, voice rising, suit wrinkled and outdated now, confidence leaking out of every gesture. When I finally agreed to speak with him, it wasn't out of guilt. It was out of efficiency. We met in a conference room. Glass walls. Neutral ground. You humiliated me, he said the moment the door closed. No, I replied calmly. You humiliated yourself. I just didn't stop it. He slammed his hand on the table. You planned this. Yes, I said. Years ago. That stopped him. For the first time, he looked confused instead of angry. You paid my debt, he said slowly. You could have let the company sue me. You could have destroyed me. I didn't want to destroy you, I said. I wanted to protect what you couldn't. His laugh was bitter. So this is charity. This is containment. He leaned back, rubbing his face. Vanessa left. Took what she could. My accounts are frozen. No one returns my calls. I said nothing. You always wanted this, he snapped. You always wanted to be in charge. I met his eyes. No. I wanted the company to survive. That was the moment he finally understood the difference between ambition and responsibility. And judging by the way his shoulders sagged, it was too late to do anything with that understanding. He left without another word. That afternoon, I signed off on a new long-term strategy, one focused on infrastructure, people, and sustainable growth. Not headlines, not optics, reality. A few days later, I received notice that Ethan was contesting the estate. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise him was how quickly it collapsed. Every document was airtight, every signature valid, every transfer documented. My father hadn't left gaps, he'd left traps, designed to close the moment someone tried to claw back what they'd squandered. The legal challenge didn't last a month. When it ended, Ethan was left with nothing but debt and a reputation no one wanted to touch. The company moved on. So did I. Late one evening, long after the office had emptied, I stood alone in the warehouse overlooking rows of outbound trucks, their lights cutting through the dark. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of being unseen. I wasn't proving anything anymore. I was building, openly, decisively, without apology. And just when I thought the past had finally finished speaking, my phone buzzed with a notification that told me it wasn't quite done yet. Because consequences don't always arrive all at once. Sometimes they wait. And in the final part, you'll see how everything came full circle. How the people who thought they could take without paying finally learned what ownership really means. The message came late, just after midnight, when the office was finally quiet and the city outside my window had softened into a blur of lights. It wasn't from Ethan. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was from a number I didn't recognize at first, until I read the first line. Asterisk, it's Mom. Please answer. Asterisk. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. My mother, Eleanor, had stayed out of everything since the funeral. She hadn't defended Ethan publicly. She hadn't congratulated me privately. She'd simply gone silent, retreating into the background the way she always did when conflict demanded a spine. I answered. Her voice was thinner than I remembered. Claire. I didn't know who else to call. We met the next afternoon at a quiet cafe near the river. She looked older. Not just grieving old, but diminished, like the structure she'd leaned on her entire life had finally collapsed, and she hadn't learned how to stand without it. He's not well, she said after we sat down. Ethan. He's angry. He says everything was taken from him. I stirred my coffee slowly. Nothing was taken. It was spent. She flinched at that. He says you planned it, that you turned your father against him. I met her gaze. Dad didn't need help seeing the truth. She sighed. I should have said something years ago. Yes, I said gently. You should have. There it was. The moment she'd avoided her entire life. She looked down at her hands. I thought keeping the peace mattered more. It didn't, I said. It just delayed the cost. She didn't argue. When we stood to leave, she hesitated. I don't expect forgiveness, she said quietly. I just wanted you to know I see you now. I nodded. That's enough. We hugged briefly, carefully, two people acknowledging something without trying to rewrite it. That was the last time I saw her. Weeks later, the final piece fell into place. Ethan tried one last move, not in court but in the press. An anonymous source leaked a story painting him as a betrayed heir, pushed aside by a cold, calculating sister. It ran for less than a day, because the receipts were already public. The contracts, the signatures, the numbers. Truth doesn't need a spokesperson when it's documented. The article disappeared. So did Ethan. Months passed. The company grew. Not recklessly. Not loudly, but solidly. Employee retention hit record highs. Safety incidents dropped. Long-term partners renewed contracts without hesitation. The empire my father built didn't just survive. It stabilized. One evening, as I walked through the operations floor after hours, Mark stopped beside me. He gestured toward the massive map tracking global shipments. He'd be proud, he said simply. I nodded. I know. And I did. Because for the first time, I wasn't living in anyone's shadow. I wasn't waiting to be acknowledged. I wasn't keeping score anymore. I owned the outcome. Leadership, I learned isn't about taking something from someone else. It's about carrying what others dropped and being willing to feel the weight of it. That night, I went home and slept deeply, peacefully, without fear of what tomorrow might bring. The empire was safe, and so was I. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated until the moment everything changed, support the channel, share this with someone who needs it, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Stories like this travel farther when we carry them together.